Imagine buying a property for a subdivision project only to find out after settlement that the property can't be subdivided. Now, best case scenario is you'll be able to resell the property, take it back to market, and ideally get your money back. Worst case scenario is you're now in a position where you've lost all of that time, you've lost a bunch of money, and you've taken a hit to the confidence. The idea behind these videos is to provide a brief insight into the various elements required for residential land subdivisions. Now in this case, it's particular Brisbane City Council. Unless you enjoy being perpetually frustrated, there's no point in running numbers, doing FISOs, and spending time and placing offers on properties that simply aren't appropriate for subdivision. For example, you may have a property that appears to be large enough to suit the requirements, but it may not have the required frontage for the number of lots you're seeking, or any number of technical little nuanced elements that don't satisfy the requirements of the council. Quite often it would seem that there's a perception of developers as these lone wolf characters operating on the fringes of society. However, if you take a little peek behind the curtain, you'll see that none of this is actually possible without partnerships and working with a vast array of people from all sorts of walks of life. Now, if you mapped it out for a large enough project, or even some of the smaller projects, and assume that each one of these jigsaw pieces in the puzzle here are either a business or represent a corporation, so you could quite easily see how you'd reach hundreds of people giving input or contributing towards the success of a project. And, in a major way, that's actually part of why I find it quite intriguing and interesting, is that, there's a large amount of complexity, there's a massive amount of challenge, and, you've got to take a really strong sense of teamwork in order to resolve a lot of these issues and get the outcome that you're after. Now, we won't be going through all of these pieces today, because there's just far too much to cover, but what we will do is touch on the local council requirements and the requirements of town planning. From my perspective, I think we can quite quickly check whether a site is viable at face value, from a town planning perspective at least, and we'll jump into that very shortly. So before we jump into those technicals around the town planning and council requirements and zoning, I just thought I'd show a quick slide of some current and recent projects that I've been working on in Brisbane City Council. Starting from left to right, the first 1 to 2 lot subdivision, Brisbane City Council, that was in low density residential, and the next 2 lot subdivision there was also low density residential. That'll be the crux of this video. And then as you move across to the 9 lot subdivision and the 18 lot subdivision, both of those were actually emerging community zone sites, which, to say the least, they're substantially more complex in terms of the review process and the input requirements from all of your different consultants. So for the time being, we'll just focus on the low density residentials. What's also quite intriguing to take a look into is the bigger picture that surrounds and informs what development is allowed on your particular site. So this really deserved its own video, given the depth of information there is behind each of these layers. But in typical fashion of government or governance, it's very much a hierarchy where the state will inform and influence the South East Queensland region, and the SEQ region will then inform the various local governments, and then of course the local council, the local government will actually dictate what can and can't be done in their particular sites. So they're given almost a bit of free rein on how they would like to see their own communities evolve and grow. So if you're looking for some bedtime reading, the SEQ regional plan, it says 2017 on there, but there's actually a 2023 version out, and that actually speaks to the growth strategy for the region and provides a vision for 2046, or in other words, where this rapidly growing population is going to be housed. Now on this page I've isolated the local and site-specific, I guess you'd call them sections of the pyramid. And the reason for doing this is I wanted to highlight those 4 dot points that are actually in the local government section. And these are very important because they can affect the potential yield of your development site. So we've got the Brisbane City Plan, which is readily accessible online. There's also a graphical interface, which we'll actually have a look at later in the video. And there's a local infrastructure plan, so where all the new roads and bikeways are going, all of that sort of jazz. Then there's the local neighbourhood plans, and there can also be temporary planning instruments. So as an example for the local neighbourhood plans, I recently looked at a site, I was planning for it to be a 12-lot subdivision, and then fortunately we work with a very knowledgeable town planner, and they suggested we look into the local neighbourhood plan because there might be some little details in there which could affect the outcome. And it actually turns out that whilst under normal rulings, it would be a 12-lot subdivision, and this is low-density residential. It turned out in a small paragraph or a small clause of the local neighbourhood plan, it was actually zoned very low residential. So what that meant is the site yield was actually only 6 lots at a maximum. So as you can imagine, that would have been a very expensive lesson, but it just speaks to the absolutely crucial value of working with your content experts, because they can save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of heartache. Right, so let's jump into it. Now, remember that for this video, we're just looking at Brisbane City Council, and what essentially provides the playbook for development in Brisbane City Council is what's called the Brisbane City Plan 2014, or it was adopted in 2014. I'll read out the definition of it. So the Brisbane City Plan is Brisbane City Council's plan for future development in Brisbane. The plan guides how land in Brisbane is to be used and developed. It helps to plan for infrastructure to support growth and protect our way of life. We're growing our city while remaining the character of our suburbs and creating a city of neighbourhoods. Now that's just a great headline for what in reality is a very complex rulebook, which our town planners specialise in. I mean, have a look at all of those different zones, not only that you can see scattered all over the map there, but also that enormous list on the right hand side there, and I'm quite confident that's not all of them either. It couldn't fit them all on the one page. But as you can see from that image, where you can see that the red and the sort of blue areas, that's Brisbane City. So as you can imagine, that's where a lot of the higher density buildings are. As you move out, there's a lot of character protection, housing zoning around there, because we want to maintain the character of our city. And as you can imagine, the city expands, you get some lower density developments further out. So just keep in mind, it's our job to know enough to have an intelligent conversation with the town planner, and that helps us be respectful of their time when we're engaging with them. So there's a phenomenal amount of work and investigation that goes into being a good town planner. But yeah, we just need to know what specific lanes we're looking in. So fortunately for us, in the resi land subspace, the number or zones of interest that we're looking at are a lot fewer than what we saw on that last slide. There are a couple more that we could include here, but we'll just stick to the basics for the time being. So you can see there on the right hand side, we've got low density residential, you've got a couple of character residential zones there, low medium residential, and then we've got emerging community, and then I've thrown in the neighbourhood centre there because that'll become relevant in the next slide. We don't typically subdivide a neighbourhood centre, but it is important to note here. So on this slide, you'll see the minimum lot size requirements for each of the various zones that we spoke about on the previous slide. So on the left-hand side there, you'll see character residential 1, character residential 2, low density within 200 metres of a neighbourhood centre, low density, LMR2, LMR3, and also emerging community. So as we read this table, so on the left-hand side shows you the zoning. Then as you move across to the right, it'll show you the minimum lot size requirement for a front lot, along with the minimum frontage requirements there. So for CR1, character residential 1, council needs to see a 450 square metre front lot, and that lot will need to have 15 metres road frontage, so 15 metres of that block needs to be facing a council road. Then if you're doing a rear lot subdivision, so like a front and rear lot subdivision, you're going to need 600 square metres of minimum area for that rear block, and it'll also need to be a minimum of 15 metres wide, similar to the front there. And you can see that it'll change as you go through the various zonings. Now, for example, you could have a nice wide CR1 blocks where you could create a 450 square metre block next to a 450 square metre block. So 2 side-by-side blocks, and then you would obviously need 15 plus 15, so a total of 30 metres of frontage. So in that case, you would need a total of 900 square metres for that block to be subdividable under CR1. Or if you're going to do a front and rear lot subdivision, you're going to need the 450 plus 600 in the total area to be able to make that subdivision work. So that'd be a minimum of 1,050 square metres, for example. Now, what we'll focus on is the low density residential requirements, and I will touch on the neighbourhood centre actually, but under the low density residential requirement, which is probably the most common that you will see for infill subdivision. So we're going to need a 400 square metre front lot with 10 metres of road frontage, and then any rear lots will need to be 600 square metres, and their average width will need to be about 10 metres as well. So just above that, touching on that neighbourhood centre, that blue shaded area in the previous slide where you can see the different zones. Now, those neighbourhood centres could be like a collection of cafes or more local businesses or shops. So you can imagine that given those neighbourhood centres, the council would encourage a slightly higher population density, or give you the ability to have a higher population density closer to those neighbourhood centres. So if you're within 200 metres of a neighbourhood centre, and I can't stress enough to check that distance with your town planner, because there are some tricky little rules around making that work too. But you'll see that the minimum lot size requirement for a front lot goes down from 400 to 300, and your road frontage requirements also drop substantially. The rear lot requirements still stay the same. But for the time being, we're just going to focus on low density residential. And if you want a copy of this slide, just shoot me a quick message. So here we have the various configurations available for a low density residential subdivision. So for example, you could have a 2-lot subdivision where you've got a front lot and a rear lot. Now in that example, you would need a 400 square meter front lot, which is 10 meters wide, and your rear lot would be 600 square meters. Now this is an exaggerated diagram because this access handle to the rear lot would realistically only need to be 3.5 meters wide in practice. Or you could do, let's say, a 1 into 4 lot subdivision where you've got 4 lots side by side. So that'd be 400, 400, 400, 400, each of those having a 10 meter frontage. Then again, with the battle axe style subdivision, you could go 400 front, then that's 600 and 600. Again, this access easement width here only needs to be about 3.5 meters. Or you could do like a 4-lot configuration here, 2 fronts, 400, 2 rears, 600. Or you could do a simple 2-lot subdivision with 2 fronts side by side. So that's just an example of the various configurations you can have for this low density example. So let's look at a real example here. There's actually a good example because you can see on the map there's a good spread of those different types of zonings that we spoke about earlier. You can see that the yellow up here is community facilities, probably a school. And then you've got a bit of open space, so council protected green space over here on the right hand side. And then you've also got, you can see that the train line is running through the middle of the screen there. And you've also got a nice little neighborhood center here in the middle of the screen with some rural zone property out here to the left. Now in this pocket up here to the top left, you can see this is all zoned low density residential. And that's the example we're going to be taking a little look at. Now, if we switch over to this tab, we can look at the property boundaries prior to the subdivision on the specific site. So what I'll do is I will put a couple of quick lines around the property boundary so you can see what we're talking about here. And they'll only be approximate at this stage. There you go. So that's basically what the property boundary looked like prior to the subdivision. And now we know from looking through City Plan or Price Finder or any other tools like that, we know that the total area of the site is 1,397 square meters. It also has a 20 meter frontage and the depth on the northern side is approximately 68 meters. So what does that look like in practice, or what does that look like in theory? Well, we know we've got 1,397 square meters. We know that we have a 20 meter frontage. Now, from our previous table, we know that the low density residential requirements for a front lot is 400 square meters minimum, and it must be a 10 meter wide frontage. And we know that our rear lot must be 600 square meters and also must have an average width of 10 meters. So applying this to the site in reality, we would end up with 2 lots. We could end up with 2 lots side by side, 10 meter frontages, and that would result in having 698 square meter lots. Alternatively, we could have a 400 square meter lot at the front of the site, and that would obviously have a 10 meter wide frontage. And then the balance of the block for a 2-lot subdivision would be 997 square meters. So those are the 2 options that are available for this particular site. Surprisingly enough, the theory side of things don't often quite match up with the practical realities of doing the actual subdivision process. So the layout that we ended up with here wasn't quite as straightforward as those slides might suggest. And the reason for that is that there's actually quite a substantial environmental area at the back here which backs onto the waterway. And so rightly so, that area is protected for the preservation of that waterway and all the flora and fauna associated with it. So we actually had to do a slight modification to the way that lot looked. And I'll just jump over to this next tab which shows you how it ended up. And what we're looking at here in the middle of the screen, so this is lot 1 here. And from memory, there was about 550 square meters in total. And then the lot next door to it was practically the same size, but it also had the balance of the environmental area at the rear, which is also protected by enduring covenants and legal agreements to make sure that is looked after. So it's effectively a side-by-side subdivision, but it's always pretty funny to see the difference between what we expect to happen on paper versus what becomes a reality when you get through to actually delivering the site. So you may ask the question, is there more to consider? And the answer is absolutely yes. We've barely touched on the requirements of local council and town planning considerations for looking at a development site. The idea here is just what is the first step that we can take to start looking at the site? And that question is, can it be subdivided? And once we get through those first couple of questions, then we can start digging deeper. So yeah, there's certainly more to consider. Just looking at the jigsaw puzzle there. Now we would start with our consultants and they will do all the I guess you'd call it the desktop assessment assessments, the paperwork assessments, assessments against legislations and rulings. And then once you move past that and through the DA phase, then you would go towards engaging your contractors to actually deliver the on-site physical works. So yeah, there's a whole plethora of people and companies that do need to be engaged to actually make a development project happen. So in summary, we can only subdivide in certain zones in Brisbane City Council, and so we can quite easily jump on the city plan, look up the address and find out what that zoning is. And then once we have that zoning, we can then look into the different rules for each of those zones. What's the minimum requirement for a front lot? What's the minimum requirement for a rear lot? How wide does the block need to be? How much frontage does that particular block need to have for the council to say, yes, that can move through to the next stage? We've also touched on how important it is to recognise our consultants as the technical experts. They live and breathe and know this stuff like the back of their hand. So it's really important to be able to have an intelligent conversation with them so we can educate ourselves to the point where we can actually engage and understand what they're talking about, and we can apply that knowledge to the ground truths that we've discovered by actually being on site. So don't be afraid to engage your experts, and don't be afraid to pay them for their time, because in the long run, and certainly in my experience, they can save you a lot of time and a lot of money.